Isaiah chapter 10, verse 9. Is not Calno like Carchemish? Is not Hamath like Arpad? Is not Samaria like Damascus? That's a list of cities and city-states conquered by Assyria, all Syrian except for some areas. Verse 14, chapter 10. My hand has found like a nest the wealth of the peoples, and as one gathers eggs that have been forsaken. So I have gathered all the earth, and there was none that moved a wing or opened a mouth or chirped. The remnant. This is one of the key themes in Isaiah. It goes back to the day God called him into service. You can go back to Isaiah chapter 6, verse 13. And it runs as a thread of hope through the darkest messages of judgment. This same faithful remnant, those who survived, is to realize all the glorious promises for the future. Continuing in chapter 10, verse 26, and the Lord of hosts will yield against them a whip, as when he struck Midian at the rock of Oreb, and his staff will be over the sea, and he will lift it as he did in Egypt. Compare this verse in Judges chapter 7 and Exodus chapter 14. Verse 28, he has come to Ahath. He has passed through Migron. At Michmash, he stores his baggage. Gibeah, just north of Jerusalem, was Saul's capital. Anathoth, a few miles east, the home of Jeremiah. Isaiah pictures an attack on Jerusalem from the north, the usual route of invading armies from countries to the north or east. Sennacherib actually approached from Lachish to the southwest. Chapter 13, Judgment of God, and watch the nations in review. Verse 1 is the Babylon judgment. Starting in verse 10, for the stars of the heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be hung at its dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. This is the conventional language for the cataclysmic day of the Lord. See Ezekiel 32:7 and Joel chapters 2 through 10, and New Testament passages Matthew 24:29 and Revelation chapter 6 verses 12 through 13. Isaiah chapter 13 verse 12. I will make people more rare than fine gold, and mankind than the gold of Ophir. Ophir, see 1 Kings chapter 9 verse 28. Isaiah verse 21 and 22. But wild animals will lie down there, and their houses will be full of howling creatures. Their ostriches will dwell, and their wild goats will dance. Hyenas will cry in its towers, and jackals in the pleasant palaces. Its time is close at hand, and its days will not be prolonged. This is a list of repulsive creatures. Turning to chapter 14, verse 4. You will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon, how the oppressor has ceased, the insolent fury ceased. The king of Babylon, the taunt song is addressed not to a particular king, but to the dynasty representing the whole kingdom. Going to verse 12. How are you fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn? How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. Morning, day star, or Venus, is a Canaanite belief, a god who made a bid to be top god. Verse 13. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. The very same thoughts brought God's judgment on Babel, Babylon's predecessor. You can see this and read about this in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. The Philistia judgment in verse 29. Rejoice not, O Philistia, all of you, that the rod that struck you is broken, for from the serpent's root will come forth an adder, and its fruit will be a flying, fiery serpent. Chapter 15 is the Moab judgment. These are all the towns in Moab. Nebo is the mountain from which Moses viewed the promised land. Zoar, a town at the southern end of the Dead Sea, spared in the overthrow of Sodom. The Valley of Willows, or Poplars, is probably the boundary between Moab and Edom to the south. Chapter 16, verse 1. Send the lamb to the ruler of the land, from Selah by way of the desert to the mount of the daughter of Zion. Selah, the rock, Edom's fortress in Jordan, is now part of the site of Petra. The fleeing Moabites have taken refuge here. Verse 2. Like fleeing birds, like a scattered nest, so are the daughters of Moab at the fords of the Arnon. Now the Arnon is a deep gorge which formed the boundary between Moab to the south and Ammon to the north. Chapter 16, verse 3. Give counsel, grant justice, make your shade like night at the height of noon. Shelter the outcast, do not reveal the fugitive. Let the outcast of Moab sojourn among you. Be a shelter to them from the destroyer. When the oppressor is no more, and destruction has ceased, and he who tramples underfoot has vanished from the land. In verse 8 we read Moab's plea to Judah. For the fields of Heshbon languish, and the vine of Sibmah, the lords of the nations, have struck down its branches, which reach to Jazer and strayed to the desert. Its shoot spread abroad and passed over the sea. The vineyards of Sibmah is a region famous for its wine. Here is a symbol of national prosperity. Verse 16, But now the Lord has spoken. In 3 years, like the years of a hired worker, the glory of Moab will be brought into contempt, and in spite of all his great multitude, and those who remain will be very few and feeble. A person bound by contract works no more than that contracted for, so 3 years and barely that. Chapter 17, the Damascus judgment. Verse 8. He will not look to the altars, the works of his hands, and he will not look on what his fingers have made, either the Asherim or the altars of incense. Asherah symbols Canaanite cult images and altars. Verse 9, in that day their strong cities will be like the deserted places of the wooded heights and the hilltops, which they deserted because of the children of Israel, and there will be desolation. The Hivites, the Amorites, tribes destroyed by the Israelites in the conquest of Canaan. Turning to chapter 19, the Egypt judgment. Verses 5 through 10. Egypt's whole economy depended on the yearly flooding of the Nile to water and fertilize the land beyond its banks. Too much or too little, as here, spelt disaster, picking up in verse 5. And the waters of the sea will be dried up, and the river will be dry and parched, and its canals will become foul, and the branches of Egypt's Nile will diminish and dry up. Reeds and rushes will rot away. There will be bare places by the Nile, on the brink of the Nile, and all that is sown by the Nile will be parched, will be driven away, and will be no more. The fishermen will mourn and lament, all who cast a hook in the Nile, and they will languish who spread nets on the water. The workers in combed flax will be in despair, and the weavers of white cotton. Those who are the pillars of the land will be crushed, and all who work for pay will be grieved. The princes of Zon are utterly foolish. The wisest counselors of Pharaoh give stupid counsel. How can you say to Pharaoh, I am a son of the wise, a son of ancient kings? Verse 13, the princesses of Zon have become fools, and the princesses of Memphis are deluded. Those who are the cornerstones of her tribes have made Egypt stagger. Zon and Memphis, respectively, the current and ancient capitals of Egypt. Zon was in the Delta region, and Memphis was just south of it on the Nile. Chapter 20, verse 3, then the Lord said, as my servant Isaiah has walked naked and barefoot for 3 years, as a sign and a portent against Egypt and Cush. The practice of this time period, POWs walked or marched through the streets naked. Chapter 21, verse 1, wilderness of the sea judgment. Perhaps a reference to the sea country, the south country, the Negev. In 13 we read about the Arabia judgment. Surrounding the land of Palestine with judgment, they will not escape either. In Isaiah we have a collection of visions and prophecies relating to various times. It is not always easy to follow, partly because we are unfamiliar with the language and the ways of prophets and visionaries, and partly because we do not know the principles which determine the present arrangements of materials. In places there is clearly a time sequence, and other parts seem to be arranged according to subject. Looking at 21 verse 16, thus the Lord said to me, within a year, according to the years of a hired worker, all the glory of Kedar will come to an end. Kedar, a powerful Bedouin tribe. Verse 22, verse 6, chapter 22, verse 6, and Elam bore the quiver with chariots and horsemen, and Kir uncovered the shield. Elam and Kir are outposts of the Assyrian Empire, which no doubt supplied conscripts to the army. verse 8. He has taken away the covering of Judah. In that day you looked to the weapons of the house of the forest. This house or palace in the forest, the city's arsenal. We read more about this in 1 Kings chapter 7 verse 2 and chapter 10 verse 17. 1 Kings 7:2. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, and its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. And it was built on 4 rows of cedar pillars, with cedar beams on the pillars. 1 Kings chapter 10 verse 17. And he made 300 shields of beaten gold. 3 binyas of gold went into each shield, and the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Returning back to Isaiah chapter 22 verse 9. And you saw that the breaches of the city of David were many. You collected the waters of the lower pool. You made a reservoir between the 2 walls for the water of the old pool, but you did not look to him who did it, or see him who planned it long ago. Water supply was vital in the event of a siege. In 2 Chronicles chapter 32, we read about the Siloam Tunnel, Hezekiah's solution to that problem. Turning to chapter 23, verse 1, Tyre, judgment ships of Tarshish. In verse 6, cross over to Tarshish, wail, O inhabitants of the coast. This Tarshish is probably Tartessus in Spain. Verse 13, chapter 23. Behold, the land of the Chaldeans. This is the people that was not. Assyria destined it for wild beast. They erected their siege towers. They stripped her palaces bare. They made her a ruin. The Chaldeans or Babylonians. Chaldea was part of South Babylonia, but when Chaldean kings came into power in Babylon, the term was used of the Babylon kingdom as a whole. Chapter 24, verses 1 through 4 is what judgment under God looks like. Starting with verse 1. Behold, the Lord will empty the earth and make it desolate, and he will twist its surface and scatter its inhabitants. And it shall be, as with the people, so with the priest, as with the slave, so with his master, as with the maid, so with her mistress, as with the buyer, so with the seller, as with the lender, so with the borrower, as with the creditor, so with the debtor. The earth shall be utterly empty and utterly plundered, for the Lord has spoken his word. The earth mourns and withers. The world languishes and withers. The highest people of the earth languish. Chapter 25, verse 10. For the hand of the Lord will rest on this mountain, and Moab shall be trampled down in his place, as straw is trampled down in a dunghill. Moab, the current enemy of God's people, stands for all such enemies. Turn to chapter 26, verse 19. Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy. For your dew is a dew of light, and the earth will give birth to the dead. It's a graphic picture of resurrection, which some take to refer to the nation, marks a new stage in Old Testament belief. The dew expresses God's power to revive the dead who lie in the earth. Chapter 27, verse 1. In that day the Lord, with his hard and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. Leviathan the dragon, or serpent figure from pagan mythology. God's judgment extends to the superhuman realm, where the powers above may be the sun, moon, and stars worshipped by other nations. See Isaiah chapter 24, verse 21. It reads, "On that day the Lord will punish the host of heaven, in heaven, and the kings of the earth, on the earth." The same figure is used in Revelation chapter 12, verse 9, to depict Satan. We read, "And the great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, and deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him." Returning to Isaiah chapter 27, verses 10 and 11, refers to the oppressors whose suffering will be far greater than that of God's people. We read, "For this fortified city is solitary, a habitation deserted and forsaken, like the wilderness. There the calf grazes, there it lies down and strips its branches. When its boughs are dry, they are broken. Women come and make a fire of them. For this is a people without discernment. Therefore, he who made them will not have compassion on them. He who formed them will show them no favor." Chapter 28. Isaiah almost never mentions ideas directly tied to the covenant with Moses at Mount Sinai, but rather draws a picture of Yahweh passionately concerned with the failures of the king and angered because the people turned from his presence as their God on Mount Zion to the other nations and their kings. The oracles in chapters 28 through 32 still contain warnings of judgment and disaster. But the following chapters go out of their way to reassure Israel and Judah that God will not abandon his promises to them and to the king. We read in chapter 28, verse 9 of Isaiah, "To whom he will teach knowledge, and to whom will he explain the message? Those who are weaned from the milk, those taken from the breast? For it is precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line. Here is a little, there a little. For by people of strange lips and with a foreign tongue, the Lord will speak to this people, to whom he has said, this is rest, give rest to the weary, and this is repose. Yet they would not hear. And the word of the Lord will be to them precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little, that they may go and fall backward and be broken and snared and taken." These verses 9 through 13, J.B. Phillips translates verse 10 and verse 13, the law is the law is the law. The rule is the rule is the rule is the rule. Isaiah's hearers are deliberately making nonsense of God's message. Verses 9 through 10 may be their sneering reply to the prophet. To those who treat God's words as gibberish, Isaiah says that God will deliver his next message in Assyria. Isaiah chapter 28 verse 15, because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we have an agreement. When the overwhelming whip passes through, it will not come to us, for we have made our lies our refuge, and in falsehood we have taken shelter. Death. The word is the same as the Canaanite god of the dead, worshipped in Egypt under different names. Isaiah 28 verse 16. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am the one who has laid a foundation in Zion, a stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone of a sure foundation. Whoever believes will not be in haste. This stone or cornerstone we also see in 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 4 that reads, as you come to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious. Here the meaning of the stone has to do with trusting God. Faith can wait patiently, confidently of safety in God. There is no need for hasty panic action. Isaiah chapter 28 verse 21. For the Lord will rise up as on Mount Perazim, as in the valley of Gibeon. He will be roused to do his deed. Strange is his deed, and to work his work. Alien is his work. Verse 21 refers to David's victories. You can read about these in 1 Chronicles chapter 14, verses 8 through 17. Isaiah chapter 29, verse 14. Therefore, behold, I will again do wonderful things with this people, with wonder upon wonder, and the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the discernment of the discerning men shall be hidden. This 14, Paul quotes the Greek version of Isaiah's words in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 19. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Returning to chapter 29 of Isaiah, verse 17, is it not yet a very little while until Lebanon shall be turned into a fruitful field, and the fruitful field shall be regarded as a forest? Verse 17 is a picture of things suddenly reversed. The forest becomes fields, and fields forest. The same thought continues in the verses that follow, picking up in verse 19. The meek shall obtain fresh joy in the Lord, and the poor among mankind shall exult in the Holy One of Israel. Humble or needy, people loyal to God, not simply the victims of social injustice. Let's look at Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 and 5. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.